Can you see and hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Great. Okay, so today we're starting the fun. We're going to start talking about Nietzsche. Who's read Nietzsche in any other class here? Do any other? I was wondering, yeah. So this is the first time you probably read some Nietzsche in class. So Nietzsche is sort of fun. The Genealogy of Morals was published in 1887. And does anyone know anything about Nietzsche's life? Anything about Nietzsche's life of interest? Fairly miserable. Yeah. There's a guy called Simmel, who's one of the founders of sociology, and he published a book at the beginning of the 20th century about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And he had this idea that Schopenhauer was this like monster who was full of life and energy and kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so, Simmel has this idea that people are attracted to what they're not. So Schopenhauer was this guy who was full of energy and life and will. And so his philosophy was a philosophy of self-denial, a philosophy of kind of pessimism, a philosophy of saying no. And Nietzsche was this quite wimpy little guy who was always poorly. He probably had sex only once in his life, yeah, and then got syphilis, probably. And at the end of his life, towards the end of the 1880s, he basically goes mad and finally has a breakdown in 1889. And after that, he becomes a sort of invalid. He's basically a vegetable, a kind of not communicative. And the last 11 years of his life, he's completely lost it. And when he's in this mad state, after he's had his complete breakdown and he's sort of degenerated, he ends up being looked after by his sister. And his sister is a really nasty piece of work. She's connected to the sort of proto-Nazi movements in Germany. Her husband is one of the leading anti-Semites. And while he was still sane, Nietzsche sort of broke with his sister and was really didn't like this sort of right-wing anti-Semitic movement that she had become a part of. But after he'd gone mad, she's looking after him and basically is kind of running his legacy. And she sets up a sort of shrine and is selling Nietzsche to these sort of groups out of which the Nazis emerge. And so his sister sort of done a very good marketing job of Nietzsche to the far right in Germany, and he is taken up by the Nazis. So in English, the reason I'm telling you this is that in English after the Second World War, the Nazis, anything associated with the Nazis is bad. So there was a very sort of negative attitude towards Nietzsche. And he wasn't really rediscovered in English until the sort of 1960s. And probably the person who's most responsible for kind of resuscitating Nietzsche in English and rescuing him from the implications of anti-Semitism is Walter Kaufmann. So the edition of the genealogy that we're reading is by Walter Kaufmann. He translated it into English. And he has a sort of running footnote he has a running commentary in the footnote, the main aim of which is to kind of persuade the readers that Nietzsche isn't a Nazi. It's the attempt to sort of rehabilitate Nietzsche in the English-speaking world. And so it wasn't until the 1960s, I think, that Nietzsche was sort of reappropriated and taken seriously again in English because of these because of this idea that he was, in some sense, appropriated by the Nazis through the agency of his sister. Now, of course, there are elements of Nietzsche's philosophy that you may worry about politically. Yeah, so he's sort of, in some sense, there seems to be this anti-democratic side of Nietzsche, very strongly anti the herd. And so one thing to ask ourselves is, yeah, what to make of it? So this work was one of the last works he wrote. In the 1880s, there was a big flurry of activity, and he just wrote like crazy as he kind of became more and more crazy. You know, in the 80s, he's just a little bit interesting. Yeah, as it goes on, like in 1888 and 1889, he starts publishing some things that are a bit strange, like Ecce Homo, which is his sort of autobiography. This is also in this translation, I didn't include it. Ecce Homo, do you know what this means? Ecce Homo. What heard of this? So Ecce, this is Latin, homo is man, look, a man. Ecce means look. And this was basically what you'd find under pictures of Jesus. So in the church, Ecce Homo means look, a man. It's Jesus. It's God being crucified. Yeah. And so Ecce Homo, the title, is an autobiography. Look, a man. It's like I am Nietzsche. I am the Redeemer. Yeah. And the titles of the chapters are things like why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books. It's quite funny. Yeah, but I think by the 1889, he's already sort of lost it a bit. So he's writing like a maniac, pretty crazy. People go and visit him. Adelaide is like, Nietzsche's been dancing naked in the streets again. So he was starting to lose it by 1889. So the genealogy is this later period of Nietzsche's life. It's very, very fruitful. The genealogy is one of the texts that is most like a philosophical text we're used to. Many of his books are made up of aphorisms, short sayings, numbered paragraphs where it's not exactly clear how they relate to each other. Along with the genealogy, books that go together with it, you've got The Gay Science. Gay science, gay here doesn't mean kind of homosexual, it means kind of happy, joyous. Yeah, and the gay science with a name for poetry. Yeah, so there's a sort of expression. So the gay science is sort of combining joy and science. Yeah, and this is what you get in something like poetry and art. And he wrote, and the final book of this, in the published version, he published it with 4 books, and then at the time of writing the genealogy, he wrote another book, The Gay Science. So the final chapter of The Gay Science was sort of written at the same time as the genealogy. And he also has Beyond Good and Evil, a couple of years before, that covers some of the same themes that are covered in the genealogy. I think these 3 kind of texts sort of go together in the sort of mature Nietzsche. But before that, you had this kind of massive, something more like a poem, a novel, a work of art. Thus spoke Zarathustra, which is more literary. I take these 3, The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, and the genealogy. If you like this, and you want something else of Nietzsche to read, either of these ones, Beyond Good and Evil goes quite nicely. So the genealogy has 3 essays. Who started reading this? Did anyone jump in already? Okay, so today I'll give you a little overview of the big picture, and then next class we'll start working through the first essay in more detail. So there are 3 essays that are sort of interconnected, but it's not obvious exactly how they relate to each other. So chapter 1 is called Good and Bad versus, you may think, Good and Evil. The second book is about bad conscience. I think it's actually called Bad Conscience and Other Stuff. It's got some weird kind of, yeah, it's just some random stuff. Bad conscience, guilt. Bad conscience, guilt, and the like. Bad conscience, guilt, etc. And book 3 is on aesthetic ideals. Yeah. So that you've got these 3. You've got these 3 essays. Aesthetic ideals, I always misspell it. I just wanted to make sure I spelled it right, because we have aesthetic ideas, and what do we mean by aesthetic? Anyone know what this means? Huh? Chile. Okay, yeah. So you have aesthetic, which has to do with beauty. Aesthetic has got to do with the sort of self-denial, the sort of person who goes out into the desert and lives in the wild and sort of tortures their body. Yeah. So the aesthetic ideal is the ideal of sort of self-denial, self-torture, it's a sort of the aesthetic ideals are behind the same time. In some sense, it's a sort of ideal of sort of self-denial, of self-torture, and the like. So we've got these 3 books. One on good and bad versus good and evil, the other one on bad conscience and guilt, and the final one on aesthetic ideals. So let me tell you what the highlights are. So the first book, he tells a story. And the basic story, so Nietzsche was not trained as a philosopher, he was trained as a philologist, a classical philologist who worked on understanding the language of ancient texts, including ancient philosophy texts. So he was trained in, he studied kind of language, and Greek and Latin, especially Greek. And the big thesis of the first book is a story about what he calls the slave revolt in morality. So he tells this story about how in ancient times that you had a quite hierarchical society, and you had sort of normative language that was made up of good and bad. So this is the sort of world you may think of the Homeric heroes. Yeah, so if you're thinking of Homer and the Greek heroes, you've got a system of valuation, a system of values that existed at that time. And what we found in this kind of earliest form of that Nietzsche thinks of evaluation is that you had a kind of caste of warriors, yeah, of aristocrats. And these aristocrats valued strength. They were basically, these aristocrats were kind of really quite stupid and vain. They used to go around beating people on the head. And what they basically called good was people like us. So in this kind of aristocratic Homeric world, the word good, what did good mean? Good meant strong, powerful, noble. Yeah, so all of the words for good are words for strong, powerful, noble. And what is bad? Bad is just the lack of these things. So bad means sort of poor. weak, etc. And for these nobles, the positive term is good. Yeah, they have a positive conception of what's good, and then their idea of bad is just like something like a lack of what's good. Yeah, to live badly is just to not live like us. Yeah, you know, I'm the aristocrat. I'm going off to Bebe, driving around in my Mercedes, and what is good is being someone like me. Yeah, and I've got this, and then you've got the peasants. You've got the kind of other guys, yeah, who don't have the Mercedes, who, you know, and they're just scum. You don't really care about them. You don't, you know, they're a bit disgusting. Like, if you think about these bad people from this noble mentality, the sort of way you feel about them, the Homeric heroes don't hate poor people. The Homeric heroes don't despise them. Yeah, the attitude towards these poor people, the slaves, is pity. You feel sorry. If you think about them at all, you feel sorry for them. Yeah, you're like, oh, ugh. Maybe you're slightly disgusted. Yeah, but in general, that you don't have. In some sense, if you're noble, if you're one of these strong people, the best thing to do is just not to think about these people. You want to hang out with your other aristocrats. Now, Nietzsche thinks that the morality we have today is completely different. Yeah, so modern, what he thinks of as modern Christian morality involves what he calls a sort of inversion of values. Yeah, you've had a sort of reevaluation of values. Yeah, that the evaluative scheme has been turned upside down. And he tells this story that the weak basically revolted. The slaves, the powerless, basically allied themselves with what he takes to be the priestly caste. Yeah, so you've got the warrior elite, and then you've got the younger brothers who are kind of don't have the strength and the power and the status, who sort of become priests. And they're full of resentment, and they sort of ally with the people. And they come up with a new morality. Yeah, and according to this morality, it's not a morality of good and bad, it's a morality of good and evil. According to this new Christian Jewish, one of the things about Nietzsche is that he says a bunch of stuff in Essay 1 about the Jews. Yeah, and you might think, oh, this is sort of typical German anti-Semitism. But actually, the thing about, he thinks the culmination of Judaism is Jesus. Yeah, and so Christianity is the sort of fruition of Judaism. And the thing about Judaism is it's a sort of priestly religion. It's rather than valuing, it's not an aristocratic sort of valuation system, but it's a priestly valuation system. And he thinks that the driving force behind this modern Christian ethics, so, and this is sort of a sort of paradox, that Christianity sells itself as a religion of love. Yeah, it's a religion of love. It's a religion that says, love your neighbor. Yeah. But Nietzsche tells this story and paints a picture that the origin of this form of valuation is in hatred, in what he calls ressentiment, resentment. Now, it's not just that it's resentment, because he's German, he's writing in German, but he, instead of saying resentment in German, he uses the French, ressentiment. Yeah, so if you go and hang out with Nietzsche people, never say resentment. You've got to kind of put on a bit of a silly French accent and say ressentiment. Yeah, and then it's clear you're talking about Nietzschean resentment. Yeah, but ressentiment is this, that what drives the poor, the weak, is a hatred of the strong, Nietzsche thinks, a hatred of power. So according to this, the modern type of system of evaluation, the basic category is evil. The basic category is negative. Yeah, and by evil, we mean something like domination. power, strength. Yeah, so evil is sort of concept of power. It's power that just expresses itself. Yeah. What's evil? Are these guys? What's evil are the kind of soldiers? What's evil are the sort of macho guys who come running in and you know, go around beating people up. Like Will Smith. Yeah, but we have, yeah, and then what's good is defined in terms of the opposite of evil. Yeah, so these people say, I'm good. And then you say, well, what is it that makes you good? Oh, I'm weak, I'm meek, I'm patient. I lack this sort of the will to dominate. The will to dominate is bad, and therefore, what's good is being non-dominated, being meek, being peaceful, being blah 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 blah. Yeah. Now, this is the kind of big picture of the first story. There's lots of interesting details in it. Now, one thing is that when you read this, at one level you might think, well, Nietzsche, so we've got these different systems of values, and then in a certain sense, once we see that our values have a history, then we can kind of evaluate our values. We can ask ourselves, what sort of value system is better or worse? And Nietzsche thinks that we should do this. We can have some criteria to do this. So we should think about these things in terms of whether they're healthy or not. Yeah, and he thinks that I mean, in some sense, it looks like sometimes when you read Nietzsche that he thinks the noble form of evaluation is better than the sort of modern one. I think that's a mistake, because I think first of all that this form of evaluation, there are some very positive things about the modern condition. First of all, so one thing is that I think that misses what's valuable about this new form of evaluation of the slave revolt. And secondly, there's an aspect. So I think what he likes about this old form of morality that he thinks is lacking from the modern slave, what he thinks of as the slave morality, is that this is a morality of saying yes, whereas this is a morality of saying no. Yeah, this is a morality that endorses something. This is a morality that rejects something. So he thinks that modern Christianized Western ethics is an ethic that's based on sort of self-denial rather than self-affirmation. And the idea of the good thing about this ancient form of valuation was that it was a form of evaluation that was based on something like self-affirmation. It was based on something like saying yes. And this sort of distinction between kind of saying no and saying yes is very central to the whole of Nietzsche's philosophy. And one of the big questions is, how is it possible to say yes to life? Yeah, and this is one of the major themes. Now, in terms of his philosophical influences, anyone know who is the philosopher that really influenced Nietzsche the most? Any ideas? So we read Hegel. When Hegel was teaching at the same time, Schopenhauer. Yeah. So anyone know anything about Schopenhauer? So Schopenhauer, I think, was one of the first Western philosophers to be really influenced by Buddhism. And he had this idea that kind of, he had this weird kind of Kantian view, where he thought we could have he made a distinction between, Kant makes a distinction between things as they are in themselves and appearances. And he said we can't know what things are in themselves. And Schopenhauer basically says we can know. Yeah, that we have appearances, the world of appearances, and then we have the world, then we have the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. And what the world is as it is in itself is will. Yeah, so the title of his major book is called The World as Will and Representation. Will and representation, Kantian distinction between thing in itself and appearance and reality, between the phenomenal and the noumenal. Yeah, but what there is in itself is will. And what will is a constant striving. Yeah, and Schopenhauer thinks about it and thinks that actually, if you think about what will is bad. Yeah, so existence is bad. Yeah, the best thing is just to not exist. Yeah, so the best thing would never to would be to have never been born. Yeah, the second best thing is just to kind of stop as quickly as you can. So you had that Schopenhauer defended this sort of what he called pessimism. Yeah, and you had these pessimist clubs of young German men who read Schopenhauer and then commit suicide. Yeah, really. Yeah, so Schopenhauer has this idea that being is in itself. It's sort of awful. It's will. He says like, and really, he thinks that in some sense we know will in itself through self-experience. We know what being is in itself through awareness of our own desires and striving. Yeah, through hunger and sexual desire. These are the kind of, that's what the world is in itself. It's just relentless hunger and sexual desire. Yeah, and what reality is in itself, in its ultimate being, is a sort of hunger. Yeah, the being is hunger, and hunger is bad. So it's better not to be. This is sort of Schopenhauer's view. But he says, listen, think about hunger. Whenever you've got something hunger is sort of resolved. It's the desire to eat. So everything that exists is the desire to eat. And for every kind of act of eating, which is good, there's something being eaten. Yeah. And the pain of being eaten is kind of much greater than the pleasure of eating. Yeah. Eating is pleasurable. So imagine kind of everything is eating and being eaten. And what sort of trade-off is there then? I'd and so Schopenhauer has this idea that being is fundamentally off, existence is fundamentally off, and I mean Schopenhauer thinks that there's some relief from the will through art. So he thinks in the experience of music, somehow you can reach a sort of calm. Maybe in aesthetic contemplation, you have moments of non-existence where the will is sort of stopped by music. And this was a philosophy, if you're a musician, you're going to like. So Wagner was very influenced by Wagner. In his early years, Nietzsche was close friends with Wagner, probably in love with Wagner's wife, but of course, because he was Nietzsche, not Schopenhauer, he didn't get any. And got more and more bitter. He sort of broke with Wagner and had a lot of sort of anti-Wagner stuff. But he started off as a sort of follower of Schopenhauer, being very influenced by Schopenhauer. But he was driven by a desire to say yes rather than say no. How is it possible to look existence in the face and still say yes? That's what Nietzsche wants. And so I think the thing he really doesn't like about the sort of modern ethics is that it's fundamentally based on a sort of no saying rather than a yes saying, of a denial rather than an affirmation. And so he's into a revaluation of values for a new sort of ethics that doesn't just go back to this noble thumping people on the head unthinkingly, but a sort of ethics of a system of valuation that is essentially affirmative. And this is where he's struggling to try and produce. Now, one thing about this good versus evil thing is that he had this idea, and I'm going to say a little bit about this second chapter now. He had this idea that that we have this sort of urge to dominate. Yeah, and this urge to dominate is not necessarily the urge to dominate other people. Yeah, but it's an urge to, in some sense, make the world ours. This is an urge that we find in poetry, in art. Yeah, say you're a sculptor, that you are, in some sense, taking a bit of clay, and you're expressing yourself. You're dominating the clay. You're informing the clay. You're imposing your sort of stamp on the external world. So this desire to dominate, to create, to inform, is, I think, he takes it to a fundamental part of what it is to be human. And he thinks that when this sort of drive isn't allowed to express itself outwardly, yeah, that it turns inwards. So if you're not allowed to, in some sense, dominate the outside world, if you're not allowed, if you're basically repressed, yeah, so you've got these drives and you're not allowed to express them, and you're not allowed to inform and dominate the external world, you turn this drive inwards, and you sort of dominate yourself and punish yourself and beat yourself. So you've got these noble warriors who are kind of going around bopping people on the head. And then you've got their kind of younger brothers and sisters who aren't allowed to do that, and they're stuck at home. And they're not allowed to go out there and hit anything and express themselves. And so what they do is they turn all of this energy and anger inwards and dominate themselves. And it's through this kind of self-domination, self-torture, that human beings become interesting. So Nietzsche thinks that these noble types are just really boring. Yeah, these noble heroic people don't have any inner life. They're basically born beasts. They're not so far different from animals. Yeah, with sort of repression comes a type of inwardness. With repression, you get all of these neuroses, and that's what Christianity emerges from. It's a sort of neurotic expression of self, of this sort of energy that's not allowed to express itself. Okay? I think some accounts of depression think that if you're angry and you're not allowed to express your anger, or it's not appropriate to express your anger, this sort of anger turns inward. This kind of inward turned anger turns into depression. But then when you're depressed, you sort of mope over things and you develop a sort of inner life. Yeah, so the emergence of this good versus evil sort of form of evaluation went together with human beings becoming interesting, developing an inner life, becoming clever. If you're not able to express your desires, yeah, think about Schopenhauer, your hunger, your sexual desires, then in some sense they get turned inward, and you sort of ignore it yourself, yeah, and develop a sort of inward depth. And of course, this basically is where Freud's getting a lot of his stuff from. So we look at the genealogy of morals. Freud sort of rewrote this in a very sort of Freudian way. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, which is sort of, I take it sort of a redoing in many ways of Nietzsche's genealogy. The idea that Freud's idea is very similar, but it's like living, we start off as animals with all these animal drives, and then we start living together in societies. And when we live together in societies, we're not able to act on all of our desires. So we've got to, in some sense, for social peace, we have to control our desires. And this leads to that energy not being turned outwards, but being turned inwards. Yeah, and Freud's sort of account is this leads to neurosis. But like, neurosis is the source of art, of poetry, of creativity. Yeah. So that's number one. This thing about bad conscience and guilt, this carries on the idea. How much time have we got? What? Okay, yeah. So So book one is about this slave revolt in morality. The second essay is about guilt, bad conscience, and the like. And it's got to do with, he's concerned with questions about responsibility, guilt, and punishment. So he has, I think one of the most famous things in here has got to do with punishment. So he thinks that these notions of guilt, bad conscience, of responsibility are tied to economic exchange. Yeah, so the idea of being guilty in German, schuldig, is tied to the idea of being debt. Yeah, so suppose you're in an exchange and you're supposed to pay someone something back. It's your turn and you don't do it. Then in a sense, you're in debt to someone else. And so he thinks, so the evidence Nietzsche gives us for this stuff is linguistic. So he looks at how in ancient languages, the words for good are all words for things like noble and aristocratic, and how the words for bad are the words for poor, unlucky, pitiable, and the like. And so he does also appeals to linguistic evidence in chapter 2, or essay 2. And he has an interesting story. So he tells this story that when he looks at punishment, in order to think about guilt, he ties guilt to the idea of debt, and then he kind of introduces the idea of punishment, and he thinks that there's a real what's the word? There's a real enigma behind punishment. So let's suppose like I borrowed some money. So I borrowed some money, and then you don't pay me back. And then instead of getting the money, I get to beat you, or you get beaten. Yeah, it's like you might think though that or let's suppose that I've got some food. I've given you some food. You're supposed to give me some food, and then instead of getting food, you get beaten. I mean, what do I get out of it? It's just like what do we get out of punishment? In what way does harming someone, in some sense, repay in any sort of way? And what does Nietzsche? Any idea what Nietzsche says? So Nietzsche wants to tie the notion of guilt. He's offering a kind of guilt. He thinks it's tied to the relationship between debtor and creditor. Yeah, so he wants to give an account of the origin of guilt in debt relationships. And it's going to turn out that he then is going to think that basically guilt is. He's going to offer us guilt is a pain that we interpret as punishment. So I feel a bit bad, and then I interpret this feeling bad as a form of punishment. But then he feels like, well, I now need to offer an account of what punishment is and the origin of punishment. And then he has this very interesting discussion about how there's something enigmatic about punishment, because punishment is something that he thinks emerges as an within economic exchange, and that if you owe someone something and you can't pay them back, then you get violence inflicted against you. And his sort of argument is why, in what sense, if you owe me a hamburger and you haven't got a hamburger, but instead I get to watch you being beaten up. So in some sense, that's supposed to pay me, that's supposed to, in some sense, be as good as a hamburger. Yeah. And then the question is why? And Nietzsche's argument. yeah, so he says, yeah, that basically that inflicting pain is a form of payment because there's a sort of joy, a pleasure in the expression of power. Yeah, so the way in which punishment can be a repayment for a debt, it only makes sense if somehow that who's been wronged somehow gets something from the punishment, and what they get is the joy of expression, the joy of inflicting pain. Now, Nietzsche thinks this is a basic fact about human beings. There is this joy, but he also thinks it's tied to weakness. So, you know, if you're poor, downtrodden, watching the rich person getting beaten up, there's some great satisfaction about that. Yeah. So, insofar as and you're driven by resentment, yeah, then in some sense the joy you get from the punishment is going to be the greater. The stronger, the more powerful you are, the less need there is for punishment. Yeah, if you're completely powerful, in some sense, the wrongdoer just bounces off you, and it doesn't matter. So, in some sense, also socially, the weaker the society, the more need there is for punishment. And a strong, healthy society, in some sense, there's going to be less need for punishment. Yeah, that insofar as you have feelings of inferiority, yeah, and you feel yourself weak, then being able to inflict pain on another is going to give you pleasure. Yeah, so you know, and I think there's something right about this social dynamic. So, you know, look at kind of populist parties that aim at these sort of a certain class of people in society who feel disempowered. And then it's like, but we can give you the kind of pleasure of here's another group who's even worse off than you. And you can just feel superior to them. You can feel superior to the immigrants. Yeah. And this is something that the pleasure of being able to dominate is something that insofar as you're not able to express yourself, as far as you're not able to, act freely, insofar as you're not allowed to express your power, then you're going to get then punishment, inflicting pain on others is going to be something that gives you pleasure. Yep.
So he says that example that desire to punish creative question the resentful ones want to punish the good ones in the aristocratic sense, and I trying to punish them and create this grandiose ethical system, and they call them evil.
So yeah, he introduces this story here. And then this chapter where you get this discussion of punishment and guilt, he says a bunch more about ressentiment. So I think what links these two together is the idea that the sort of pleasure we get from inflicting pain is sort of tied quite often to ressentiment, to this feeling of being constrained, of being dominated. So insofar as you're kind of dominated by others, then if you get a chance to dominate someone else, that's going to give you a kick. Yeah. And so the sort of weaker you are, the more, the more receptive you're going to be. So I think there's a nice sort of way of thinking about populist politics. Yeah. The more kind of dominated you are, and the more you feel dominated, the more you're going to enjoy, think about kind of, oh, we're going to do bad things to white Turks. And if you feel like you're dominated, this is something you're going to enjoy. Yeah, because you're finally getting a chance to, express your power, to feel powerful. Yeah. And so this feeling of power he thinks, is one of the sort of big motivations in human interactions and in the emergence of value. So it's a sort of felt feeling of power. And in some sense, the will to cruelty is going to be strongest in those who are the most dominated. Yep. And so, yes, you're going to find it in the slaves. Yeah, the slavish personality, in some sense, is driven by ressentiment and cruelty. Yeah, and hatred. And he says, you know, these sort of noble guys don't really hate. They have enemies, and they sort of love. They want a good enemy, and they want to have a good fight. And yeah, the priests are the great haters, the great people who are driven by cruelty. In book one, he has this long quote in Latin by Tertullian, and Tertullian is one of the early church fathers, and there are big arguments about whether Christians should go to the games. You know, the games where they're burning Christians, but you know, they'll bring in some prisoners and they'll get them to be killed by animals. And so the Christians tended not to like these sort of games. And Tertullian has a kind of pamphlet against a good Christian shouldn't go to the games. Why? Because if you're a good Christian, after you're dead, you don't need to go to the games, because after you're dead, you're going to get front row seats to the suffering of all your enemies in hell. Yeah, so all of these people who've been persecuting you, they're going to be condemned to eternal punishment in hell. And one of the great things about heaven is not just you're going to be with your mates, but it's like you get to watch all your enemies suffering in hell. It's just like, imagine that joy. Tertullian had this long kind of discussion of it. Aquinas said something similar. Aquinas says one of the great things about being the blessed is to experience the suffering of the damned. Yeah, Nietzsche just thinks this is crazy. You know, you got this religion of love, but what's motivating it is this kind of gnawing hatred that comes from a feeling of weakness. And it's all kind of driven by the kind of desire to see, and you know, you're so weak, you can't hurt these people in real life. So you have to hurt them in your imagination. You hurt them in this sort of afterlife, in hell. Yeah, this is the emergence of hell. Yeah, it's, you know, hell emerges in the minds of weak people, of slaves, of the oppressed, as a way of getting revenge in their imagination that they can't get in reality. Yeah, and in some sense, this is what Nietzsche thinks is driving, or is the origin of this Christian ethics. Yeah, so we've got this idea of punishment. And then there's an interesting discussion about how that once we've got the practice of punishment, we can then use this practice to interpret our own suffering. So the idea of guilt is that we've got something's not going right, and then we can interpret that as punishment. And Nietzsche says that pain. So this is where he sort of disagrees with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thinks that, well, you've got eating and you've got being eaten, and it's much worse. Being eaten is much worse than eating. And Nietzsche finally came to the idea that pain itself isn't that bad. Yeah, pain is just bad. Yeah, what's bad isn't pain. What's bad is meaningless pain. So human beings are these sort of interpreting animals. What we do is we try and give meaning to our life. And the thing we can't deal with is meaningless pain. Yep. So what we try and do is we try and give meaning to our pain. We try and interpret it. And he thinks that within this Christian ethics, we basically interpreted pain as punishment. So when things are feeling bad inside, I give it a meaning. I say, I'm being punished for not, the ancient world, you may have thought, I'm getting punished because I didn't do the rituals properly. I did something wrong, that my forefathers are angry at me. And then he tells a story about how this idea of pain as punishment goes completely crazy in Christianity. So according to the Christian story, you owe God something. So God's created you and you owe him for the creation. So you've got this absolute guilt. You've got this absolute debt to God. And then you're like, how can you pay God? How can you repay God for creating you? And you've got this guilt, this pain that can't be, this debt that can't be paid back. And then Christianity, he says, has this master stroke that God says, don't worry, you don't have to pay for it. I'll pay for it myself. How? By crucifying myself. so God basically tortures himself to pay you back, to pay back himself the debt you owe him. Yeah, and this is Nietzsche's, this is Christianity. And it's like, hold on a minute. No, I don't just owe God back for creating me, I owe God back for torturing himself. And it's just like, my debt has just got more and more and more and more, and it's just sort of spiraling out of control. So Nietzsche thinks that this sort of ethics is sort of unhealthy. Yeah. And then he's going to offer an alternative. And I take it that one sort of thing is, once you realize about interpretation, that you have a sort of poetic kind of interpretation. You can think, the thing about pain is it can be turned into the source of a good story. Yeah. So I think Nietzsche thinks that pain can be redeemed if it's sort of taken as the source of art or the source of creativity. Yeah. And so I think ultimately he ends up with this quite aestheticized form of evaluation he's looking for. So I talked about the first two chapters. Maybe next class I'll tell you a little bit about the third. I'm giving an overview now, and then we'll start looking through the text. I'll tell you a little bit about the aesthetic ideals. Here we have the idea of self-denial, the idea of the priest. But then he thinks that the highest form of the aesthetic ideal is going to be what he calls, or one form of it is the world of truth. Now, as a philosopher, he thinks we're driven by this world to truth. And he thinks that one of the things he wants to question is the value of truth. And I think he has some interesting things to say about truth. My reading on Nietzsche and truth, you have these sort of postmodernist readings where Nietzsche is just against truth and you can say whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. I think that really he's against truth with a big T, but he's fine with a kind of pluralism about truth. So one of the things that when it comes to truth, Nietzsche defends a form of what's known as perspectivalism. That there are lots of different perspectives on the world. Each perspective gives you some truth. And the problem with truth with a big T is truth with a big T wants to be this kind of final perspective, wants to be a sort of view from what Thomas Nagel calls a view from nowhere, a perspective that doesn't have a point of view. We might think this is the idea of absolute objectivity, a sort of God's eye perspective on the world. Yeah, which is a kind of final, and this is what Nietzsche is sort of against. Is against this idea of a final perspective. But that's compatible with there being truth from a perspective. Yeah, and some perspectives can be more inclusive than others. Yeah, we can take a step back and we can include a number of different perspectives. We might think that intersubjectivity, I've got my perspective, you've got your perspective. Maybe there's a kind of intersubjective perspective that is more inclusive. So I think the idea of perspectivalism is compatible with truth with a small t. It's just against the idea of something like absolute objectivity. So one of the things we'll look at in this chapter is the discussion of perspectivalism and Nietzsche's view of truth. If anyone's interested in Nietzsche on truth, there's a nice book by Maud Mary Clark, and I think the title is something like Nietzsche on Truth or Nietzsche on Truth and Interpretation, something like that. Quite 20 years old. Okay, so next class we'll carry on. Bye-bye.